Welcome to our deep dive today.
Glad to be here.
We're diving into a pretty fascinating part of the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
2 Corinthians 12:1-21.
It's a good one.
It is. And we've got the actual text right here,
Yep.
along with your notes and some study guides.
That's right.
We're really ready to kind of unpack this.
Yeah.
All the biblical intrigue.
Yeah.
Before we jump into chapter 12 specifically, though,
Sure.
can you give us a quick recap of what 2 Corinthians is all about?
So 2 Corinthians is one of the letters that Paul wrote to the early Christian church in Corinth.
Gotcha.
This particular letter is actually his second letter to them.
Okay.
And it's clear that their relationship was a bit complicated.
Okay, so complicated how? In what ways?
Well, the Corinthian church was dealing with a lot of internal conflicts, a lot of divisions. There were issues of immorality, questions about Paul's authority, and even financial disputes.
Seriously?
Yeah, so Paul's letter is an attempt to address these problems, makes head on.
Yeah.
Guide them back to a place of unity and faithfulness.
So almost like imagine a parent writing a letter to their child who's going through a rebellious phase.
Yeah.
That's kind of the vibe we're getting here.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Paul is clearly heartbroken by the state of the Corinthian church, but he also deeply loves them and wants to see them thrive.
Right.
And it's this tension between love and concern that makes 2 Corinthians so powerful.
It's relatable even today.
Yes, even thousands of years later.
Thousands of years later.
Yeah.
All right. So with that context in mind,
Okay.
let's dive into chapter 12. Right from the start.
Yes.
Paul drops this bombshell as a story about a vision he had.
Yeah. So verses 2-4 describe a man being caught up to the third heaven, to paradise, hearing things unspeakable, things not lawful for a man to utter. It's an incredibly evocative language.
It is.
Hinting at a profound mystical experience.
It's interesting to me, though, that Paul doesn't come right out and say that it was him who had this vision. He uses the third person talking about a man in Christ. What do you make of that?
That's one of the things that makes this passage so intriguing.
It really is.
While Paul doesn't explicitly say it's him, a lot of scholars believe it is.
Okay.
Based on the context and his later references to personal revelations.
It makes you wonder, like, maybe he was hesitant to talk about it directly.
Sure, yeah.
Like maybe it was such an overwhelming personal experience.
He could have been.
That he struggled to put it into words.
That's a really insightful observation.
Oh, thanks.
And in fact, that reluctance to boast about his own spiritual experiences actually becomes a key theme throughout this letter.
Interesting. Okay, so let's say it was Paul who had this vision.
Okay.
What would that have meant for his authority?
Well, imagine experiencing something like that. Being transported to the third heaven, hearing things beyond human comprehension. In the context of early Christianity, such a vision would have given Paul immense credibility.
Wow.
It would have been seen as a sign of divine favor, a confirmation of his apostleship.
So almost like this vision becomes a foundation for his ministry.
Precisely.
A source of his authority to speak on behalf of God.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is that immediately after describing this incredible vision, Paul introduces the concept of his thorn in the flesh.
Ah, yes. The infamous thorn.
Right.
One of those biblical mysteries that's captivated readers for centuries.
Yes.
And the text never explicitly says what it was.
No, it doesn't.
So we're left with a lot of questions.
A lot of theories.
A lot of theories.
Yeah.
Was it a physical ailment?
Could have been.
A chronic illness?
Possibly.
A persistent temptation?
Maybe.
Or maybe opposition from his enemies?
It's possible. We just don't know for sure.
And that ambiguity has led to all sorts of speculation over the centuries, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
I've heard everything from eye problems to malaria to speech impediments.
I've heard those too.
All suggested as possible thorns.
It's fascinating. And while it's tempting to try to pinpoint the exact nature of the thorn, I think Paul's intention was to focus on its purpose rather than its specific form.
So what was that purpose, according to Paul?
He describes it as a messenger of Satan
Oh, wow.
Sent to buffet him, to keep him humble in light of those incredible revelations.
So it's almost like a counterbalance to that incredible vision.
Exactly.
Like a way of preventing him from becoming too proud or self-important.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks.
It's like God is saying, yes, I've given you this incredible experience, but don't let it go to your head.
Right.
You're still human, you're still vulnerable, and you still need my grace.
And the thing is, Paul didn't just passively accept this thorn.
No, he didn't.
He begged God to remove it.
He did.
Not once.
Not twice.
But 3 times.
3 times. 3 times.
He really wanted it gone.
Yeah. And I think that detail really humanizes Paul.
In what way?
Well, here's this towering figure of early Christianity wrestling with something incredibly painful and persistent.
Right.
He's not superhuman, you know?
Yeah.
He's just like us, struggling, pleading with God for relief.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's a reminder that even the greatest spiritual leaders experience hardship and pain. They aren't immune to the struggles of life.
Not at all. Yeah, they're definitely not immune.
So what was God's response to Paul's repeated pleas to remove the thorn?
Well, God's answer is found in verses 8 through 9.
Okay.
My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And these words are incredibly powerful and really get to the heart of this passage.
They're definitely words to ponder. God isn't promising to remove the source of pain.
Right.
Instead, God is offering something maybe even more profound.
Exactly. God is assuring Paul, and by extension, all of us, that his grace is enough. It's in those moments of weakness, you know, when we acknowledge our need for God, that his strength shines through most brightly.
It's like that saying, we are strongest when we embrace our vulnerability.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a radical concept, especially in a culture that often equates strength with power, you know, dominance and never showing weakness.
Yeah.
Paul is turning that idea on its head.
So how does this concept of strength and weakness tie into Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church?
Well, it's actually a key theme that runs through the entire letter.
Right.
Remember, the Corinthian church was facing a lot of challenges.
Right. Divisions, immorality, questions about Paul's authority.
Yeah, they were struggling to live out their faith in a unified and authentic way. And Paul, despite his own struggles with the thorn, approaches them with incredible patience and compassion.
Interesting.
He doesn't come in with a heavy hand. Or try to assert his dominance over them.
Instead, he chooses to lead by example.
Precisely. Demonstrating the power of vulnerability and humility.
I like that.
In verses 13 to 15, Paul talks about his refusal to take financial support from the Corinthians, even though he had every right to do so as an apostle.
You're referring to that part where he says, "For I seek not yours, but you."
Yes, such a simple statement, but it speaks volumes about his priorities.
It really does.
Paul is saying, I'm not here for your money. I'm here for you. I'm here to invest in your spiritual growth to see you flourish as individuals and as a community.
That's a powerful message for anyone in a position of leadership.
It is.
Whether it's in a church, a business, or even a family.
I agree. Paul is modeling a type of servant leadership.
Yeah.
Putting the needs of others above his own, even when it means facing accusations and misunderstandings.
Because, of course, not everyone appreciated his approach.
No, they didn't. In fact, Paul's refusal to take financial support actually led some Corinthians to question his motives and accuse him of improper conduct.
So they probably thought, well, if he's not taking our money, he must be getting it from somewhere else.
Exactly. It's interesting how even back then, financial transparency was a big issue in ministry.
It's still an issue today.
It is.
So how does Paul address these accusations? He doesn't just ignore them.
No, he doesn't shy away from them at all. In verses 11 to 12, he expresses his frustration at having to defend himself.
Makes sense.
But he does so by pointing to his track record. The signs of an apostle he's performed among them.
Including
miracles and acts of service.
Oh, wow.
He's essentially saying, look, my ministry is legitimate. I've proven myself through actions, not words.
Right. So show, don't tell.
Exactly. And he brings in Titus as a supporting witness.
Oh, yeah. Titus.
He mentions that Titus, whom he had sent to Corinth earlier, also refused to take financial support from the church.
So it's like he's saying, this isn't just me being weird. It's a principle we live by.
Exactly.
It's establishing a precedent for ethical conduct in ministry.
Precisely. And that's something that's still relevant today.
For sure.
Paul's example challenges us to think about how we can ensure financial transparency and accountability in our own organizations and institutions.
It's a good reminder that true leadership isn't about personal gain or self-promotion.
Right.
It's about serving others with integrity.
Yes.
And putting their needs first.
Absolutely. And it's about being willing to embrace vulnerability and humility.
Yeah.
Even when it means facing criticism or questioning.
So even though Paul was clearly frustrated by the accusations he faced, he chose to respond with grace and transparency rather than defensiveness or anger.
Absolutely. He models a way of engaging in difficult conversations with humility and a willingness to be vulnerable.
Right.
Even when it's painful.
That's a powerful lesson, especially in our current culture, where it seems like everyone is so quick to get offended or defensive.
I agree. Paul's example reminds us that sometimes the strongest and most effective way to address conflict is with grace and transparency, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Which brings us to the final section of this passage where Paul talks about his upcoming third visit to Corinth.
Yes.
It's clear that he's approaching it with a mix of anticipation and trepidation.
A lot of emotion packed into those final verses.
Yeah, on one hand, he's eager to see the Corinthians again.
Right.
And hopes to find them living in unity and faithfulness. But on the other hand, he's worried that he might find them unchanged.
Yeah.
Still caught up in those same conflicts and divisions that have been troubling him.
He even expresses fear that he might have to be stricter with them this time around.
Yeah. In verse 14, he says, "For I fear lest when I come I shall not find you such as I would, and that I shall be found unto you such as ye would not." There's a real sense of vulnerability and anxiety in those words.
Yeah, like he's bracing himself for the possibility of having to confront them about their behavior.
Yeah.
Even though it pains him to do so.
And he's even worried that he might have to bewail many which have sinned already and have not repented.
That's a heavy burden to carry. He clearly cares deeply for the Corinthians, but he's also wrestling with the responsibility of holding them accountable for their actions.
Right. That tension between love and accountability is something that all spiritual leaders face.
It is.
How do you balance grace with truth? How do you hold people accountable for their actions without being judgmental or condemning?
Such a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it's a balance that Paul continues to navigate throughout the rest of 2 Corinthians.
Okay.
But I think this passage in chapter 12 really lays the groundwork for those later conversations.
In what way?
By establishing some key themes. The power of God's grace and our weakness, the importance of servant leadership, and the tension between love and accountability.
These are definitely themes that resonate even thousands of years later.
I do.
They offer guidance not only for those in positions of leadership, but for anyone seeking to live out their faith in a complex and often challenging world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is a complex world out there.
It is.
It's amazing how a passage written so long ago can still speak to us so directly today.
I agree.
We've been talking about Paul's vision, his thorn in the flesh, his financial transparency, and his anxieties about his upcoming visit to Corinth.
Yeah, and what I'm finding so fascinating is how Paul's vulnerability actually strengthens his message.
It does. It makes it more relatable, you know.
More human.
Yeah, more human.
It disarms those who might be inclined to dismiss him as some sort of superhuman figure.
Right.
And allows his message to resonate on a deeper level.
He's not afraid to admit that he doesn't have all the answers.
That's right.
That he's still wrestling with those difficult questions.
Yeah.
And that he relies on God's grace to sustain him.
And in doing so, he challenges the Corinthians and us to rethink our own definitions of strength and success.
Interesting.
He's not advocating for weakness, but rather for a strength that is rooted in humility and dependence on God.
It reminds me of that famous quote, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." That seems to be the thread that runs through this entire passage.
Absolutely. It's there in Paul's scorn, in his approach to ministry.
Right.
And even in his anxieties about the Corinthians.
Yeah, he recognizes that it's not his own strength or charisma that will ultimately transform lives.
It's not.
But the power of God working through him.
Right.
Even in those moments of weakness.
Exactly. Yeah. So as we approach the final verses of this passage, what's the key takeaway you want listeners to grasp?
Well, I think the final verses really highlight the depth of Paul's love for the Corinthians.
Yes.
Even in the midst of his concerns and anxieties.
Yeah, he reiterates his commitment to serving them, to pouring himself out for their spiritual growth.
Yeah.
Even if it means risking rejection or misunderstanding.
He says, "I will very gladly spend and be spent for you, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved." It's a heartbreaking statement.
It is.
It reveals the vulnerability that comes with loving deeply and selflessly.
It's a reminder that genuine love often involves sacrifice and risk.
Right.
It doesn't demand reciprocity or guarantee a positive outcome.
It's about choosing to give freely, even when it's difficult or costly.
Exactly. And that kind of love, that willingness to give without expecting anything in return, is ultimately a reflection of God's love for us.
It is. Paul's example points us to the ultimate example of self-sacrificing love.
Yes.
Jesus Christ, who willingly gave his life for us, even though we didn't deserve it.
And that's a message that resonates with people of all ages and backgrounds.
It does, whether you're a seasoned theologian or just beginning to explore your faith.
Yeah. The concept of unconditional love is something we can all connect with.
Absolutely. It's a universal language that speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
I agree.
And I think that's what makes 2 Corinthians 12.1-20 so powerful.
It's true.
It's not just a theological treatise.
No.
It's a story about love, about struggle.
Yes.
About the transformative power of God's grace.
Right.
Working in and through our weaknesses.
So well said.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into this passage. Thank you for sharing your expertise and helping us unpack these complex ideas.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore key Corinthians further on your own. There's so much richness to be discovered in this letter, and we encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep seeking a deeper understanding of God's love and grace in your own lives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.